Thank you. So, greetings from New Orleans and the illustrious Dillard University. My name is Zella Palmer, Director and Chair of the Dillard University Ray Charles Program in African American Material Culture. Today, we have the honor to host DJ Lynnee Denise. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We would like to give a special thanks to Dillard University President, Dr. Walter Kimbrough, Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Yolanda Page. We also would like to encourage our listeners to learn more about the Dillard University Ray Charles program and our food studies minor. After our conversation, I will provide a link to learn more about our program and our food studies minor for interested students. Also, some links to our Legacies of American Slavery short film series produced by our students, Levante Lucas and Sharice Campbell, and DJ Lynnee's curated playlist for tonight's talk. Also, please register on Eventbrite for our next talk on March 10th, where I will be in conversation with Chef Therese Nelson, founder of Black Culinary History. After our conversation, we will hopefully have enough time to open the floor for questions and answers. So please add your questions to the Q&A box. I must also say, I want to lift up Ray Charles' name and just this, yes, thank you, the visionary and legend behind this program. And it is so fitting that we are talking about music tonight and the legacies of slavery. So let me properly introduce the esteemed DJ Lynnee Denise. DJ Lynnee Denise is an artist, scholar, writer, and DJ whose work reflects on underground cultural movements in the 1980s, migration studies, theories of escape, and electronic music of the African diaspora. Denise coined the phrase DJ scholarship to reposition the role of the DJ from a party purveyor to an archivist, cultural custodian, and information specialist of music with critical value through interactive workshops, lectures, and presentations at universities, conferences, and performance venues. Denise harnesses music as a medium for vital public dialogue on how to transform the way the music of the Black Atlantic is understood in its social context and beyond entertainment. Denise lives and works between Amsterdam and London. We just love looking at her life. We follow her all the time. We are convened here today for the Legacies of American Slavery, a multi-year project initiative of the Council of Independent Colleges in cooperation with the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at the MacMillan Center at Yale University, supported by a generous grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation with supplemental funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dillard University was selected as one of the regional collaboration partners that will focus on the fundamental theme, cultural creativity, defined as a cultural expression in all its forms as a way to understand and cope with American slavery and its aftermath. Through the cultural creativity theme, Dillard will explore the following sub-themes: food, music, and tourism. So let us begin our conversation, DJ Lynnee, and learn how music is the soundtrack of American material culture, and particularly African American material culture and the legacies of American slavery. So you curated this playlist. Walk us through what you were thinking when we invited you to be a part of this talk.
So thank you again for welcoming me. And one of the things that I feel like is important to do is just to call a few names that are, linked to, I think, what is the sacred land of New Orleans. And so I just want to, before speaking, honor folks like the Rebirth Brass Band and Mahalia Jackson and Louis Armstrong and Mia X and No Limit, right? And Jay Electronica and the Meters.
Yeah.
And Dr. John and Marie Laveau, right? I mean, New Orleans, and then to have Ray Charles be a guiding voice, and someone who we can kind of be accountable to in this conversation. I'm just honored. So I just want to start there with saying thank you to, New Orleans. New Orleans is a special place for me, and just thinking about Black music and place, and obviously Congo Square, and we're going to get into all of that. But I'm just like, I get, when I land in that city, I feel it, right? It's on my skin because the spirits are there. And I can just see Mahalia Jackson's syncopated hand claps, which is something that I've been sitting with a lot lately. So perhaps I can even think about the music list in terms of, making sure that folks like Mahalia Jackson was there. But as a Black college graduate myself, I went to Fisk University and graduated in 1997. And I kind of forged a minor for myself, which was Black music history. And I had, advisors that were like, I don't know what you want to do. What do you mean you want to create a sort of independent, you know, um, minor? And I was like, well, here's the thing. You all talk about the Fisk Jubilee singers. We know the work that Du Bois has done around the sorrow songs and the souls of Black folk, but we're not having conversations about the ways in which Black music evolved from old Negro spirituals with the same rigor, So I took it upon myself to do, independent research projects every year, which counted towards my degree. And so part of that included, yes, a deeper dive into old Negro spirituals, a deeper dive into blues, into soul, into jazz. And then because this was the 90s, I was bent on making sure that we made links between funk and hip hop and soul. At the time, I wasn't really hip to house music like I am now. As a partly, I would say that house is up there with astrology, which is kind of like part of my religion. This is where, where this this is where the work happens. This is where the release happens. I understand the dance floor is a sacred place now in a different way through house music. But when I was thinking about that list, I was thinking about a chart created by an amazing Black woman ethnomusicologist by the name of Portia Maltby. Um, I would advise anyone watching the show, and if you've had a chance to listen to the playlist I created, to look up that Black music chart. There are two by Patricia Maltby, where she outlines Black music in America starting from the 1600s. And she outlines the music based on three categories. The first being spiritual, the second being sort of secular, and the third category being secular instrumentals, right? So from this, from the spiritual category, she has like field songs, work songs, all the way down to, the 1990s Kirk Franklin, kind of, or thinking through legacies or the lineage and gospel music. And then she has, in the middle, this kind of, um, you know, evolutionary exploration of soul music, of ragtime music, of vaudeville music, of blues music, of soul music, of funk music, right? And then in the other category, she has bebop jazz, hard jazz, so all of those categories. And when I look at that chart closely, and when I teach that chart, what comes up for me is not just the way that she's mapped these things out based on year and genre, but that these things are mapped out based on how Black people were moving through the country, right? And so you can sort of trace, oh, I can see how rural blues ended up, landing in Chicago and becoming urban blues, and then this kind of electronic guitar becoming part of the voice of the urban blues, but also a number of blues musicians who then traveled to Houston, Texas, where R&B was being developed, as in rhythm and blues, not necessarily the R&B in the contemporary context, or just thinking about the migration routes, thinking about music migration and thinking about how music migration and Black dance creates genre. And so and subgenres, and that is traceable through this map. And actually, I would say in the mind of many DJs, right, that we can create these sets based on time and place, because I do believe that there is an intellectually rich practice involved in the deep dive, the investigative practice that I feel like DJing and DJ culture provides both those who are listening to what we're presenting and those who are digging through the crates to present. So yeah, that music, I was trying to get, to those places that were mapped out based on the work of Dr. Portia Maltby. And so on that chart includes prison songs, work songs, the Fisk Jubilee singers, the Macintosh singers based on the ring shout culture, of course, Mahalia Jackson. But I was thinking about, who else? Not just the Clark sisters, that's a different generation, but I'm thinking about the Caravans. I'm thinking about Thomas Dorsey and making a connection between Thomas Dorsey and, of course, Mahalia Jackson, but then, of course, James Cleveland, but then, of course, Aretha Franklin, but then, of course, C.O. Franklin. And so it's fun to map these stories out sonically and then to see it visually and to use that word map. And what does the map of Black music in the afterlife of slavery look like? And so that's what, yeah, that's what came up for me, is just thinking about music, place, and not just resilience, because I'm like, I think, but if anything, continuity and ancestral memory, endurance, the articulation of our social experiences. And to borrow a phrase from, I was going to say the Honorable, and I mean it, the Honorable Dr. Clyde Woods, blues epistemology, and thinking about Black music as a form of social explanation beyond its entertainment value. And so I think in that story, in that playlist, there is a story. There is a story that can be mapped out. We could look at it. We could create a visual picture of it. And so we can move it from the sonic to the visual.
Thank you for sharing that. And I really appreciate, I know all of our listeners who are listening from New Orleans and elsewhere appreciate how much we love New Orleans, and just really, it's such a sacred space, and it's such an honor to, teach at Dillard University. Our students who are listening this evening, anybody else who also is listening, any Dillard alums, it's sacred ground. We celebrated our 150th anniversary before COVID. So, every HBCU, it's just, such an honor to be a part of an HBCU legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate also, I was born and raised in Chicago. So I appreciate the shout out to house music and to blues.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being a little girl and my grandparents and my parents taking me to Maxwell Street and seeing the old bluesmen play before gentrification. So, I sent you a list, and, you and I were going back and forth, and I'm just going to read some of these genres out to you. And of course, we can't touch on everything this evening, but I wanted us to really start from the beginning, because this is also a discussion about giving voice and solidifying our place as skilled and centuries old people who came to this country enslaved with our own culture, our own memories, right? And I can remember, I think I posted it on, and I encourage everyone to follow Dillard_Ray Charles. I posted, and I'll do it later as well, a Louisiana prison song that was the same melody as a prison song in Louisiana for part of the chain gang from Senegal, right? So this cultural memory and this legacy, we talked about, I'm just going to go through the genres so we can kind of, just capture this evening. West and Central Africa, the drum, the power of the drum. Also Moorish influences, because we sometimes start with slavery, but we don't go before that, right? The banjo and how that was important, the instruments that were brought with enslaved people. Here in New Orleans, we have a culture of opera. Had Black composers, that we have plenty of Black composers who, left and went to Mexico and France after the Louisiana Purchase. Nursery rhymes, national anthems. We just watched the Super Bowl. We saw Mary Mary perform, Lift Every Voice and Sing to All Americans for the first time, and that Legacy of Star Spangled Banner. Negro spirituals, gospel. You mentioned Mahalia Jackson and how she took what, she was born and raised in New Orleans and took that to Chicago, and she opened up a fried chicken franchise in Chicago. The intersectionality of Black and Indigenous music. Native Americans were part of, that shaping the blues. New Orleans, prison songs, blues, folk, country. I mean, Ray Charles sang plenty of country songs. You know, Zydeco, jazz, doo-wop, rock and roll, soul, funk, disco, R&B, house, hip hop. And I always, you know, just to contextualize, I saw, you know, you had some songs on there, some very powerful songs to, you know, for those of students who are listening who might not be familiar with some of the, you know, the legendary hip hop songs, but we always talk about, even just in food studies, for example, Meek Mill's song, Oodles of Noodles Babies, and how ramen noodles, you know, and how food can be traced, and they're telling you what's happening in the Black experience at this time. And it's telling you also in mainstream culture, mainstream American culture, what's happening in each song and each genre and generation. Reggae, roots, bounce, you know, the sounds of Black street culture, juke, go-go, hyphy, mambo, salsa, reggaeton, Afro beats, high life, and the power of social media in connecting Africa and the diaspora, and eventually making a mainstream and global sound that crosses all genres, cultures, and ethnic groups. So we'll just listen to you, and you know, wherever you feel like going from here. It's from the beginning, just the seeds that we brought with us as far as music.
Yeah, that list is extensive, and it's an amazing list, and it's an important list. You know, as you were speaking, you know, well, first of all, much of this music can be found on Dr. Maltby's list. So I think that, you know, that's just going to be a great guide for the conversation for those who were able to access it. Thank you to the person who posted that list. Um, but yeah, you know, I think that certainly for me, and starting with the roots of it all, you know, West and Central Africa and perhaps other parts of Africa, because I'm not even clear about the story of I'm curious about what we don't know about certain places that, right, were touched by slavery. Like I know that I know that the West Coast was the port and the place with which, you know, the door of no return. And but you know, I'm curious about the role of, say, for example, Southern African music and culture in and, you know, Eastern African influences on folks in, you know, who crossed the Middle Passage. I don't know who was on that ship and where they were from and where they migrated from prior to being, you know, seized, kidnapped. But I do want to say that there are some key things that come to mind when we start, you know, and thinking about Black music in this diasporic or this Black Atlantic context, you know, like, you know, thinking about the work of Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall, and thinking about this notion of creolization, which is an interesting word, and thinking about New Orleans, but also hybridity, you know, and how it's really difficult to get to the origin, right, of much of who we are as people of the Black Atlantic. But I think, you know, what comes to mind for me just in having visited the continent, so moving away from, you know, textbook scholarship, is what I witnessed, was the mastery of syncopation, the mastery of improvisation, the mastery of polyrhythms, the mastery of call and response, the use of humor in lyrics and or performance through the body as an instrument, right? And of course, the notion of the ring shout, which I believe is something that also traveled from different places and landed, you know, in North America in this way that allowed us to root the music in this play with temporality, and thinking about the ring shout and memory and future oriented faith, and praise, and the energy that is created by people in a circle. And then what happens when someone gets pushed to the middle of the circle, while the circle, right, is generating the energy that that person needs to create a signature in that space, calling on spirits, calling on the collective energy, right? Those are things that I feel like I witnessed in Africa, but that I continue to, and let me not just say Africa, like that I witnessed in Ghana, that I witnessed in South Africa, that I witnessed in Mozambique, right? I continue to see Black folks and their mastery of syncopation. It also makes me think of, thinking about ancestral memory, the way that I engage music, or the way maybe that I want to engage it or even understand it, is in thinking about Julie Dash's approach to Daughters of the Dust, in which she was able to capture, Congo Square energy, intersectionality, obviously with Black and Indigenous people, ancestral memory, what, house music or whatever it, evolves into or from or emerges from or is developed into house music. I'm just thinking about Julie Dash's approach to Blackness and the afterlife of slavery. And that's what I'm trying to work through with music, is kind of putting all of those things in conversation, and creating perhaps an understanding that a new language is created when we are, I don't want to root us in a place of trauma. I really do try to stay away from words like resilience and even just kind of thinking about, joy and pleasure in the way that I know we've been engaging it, and necessarily so. But I just really want to sit with the migration, not just of people, but also of ideas, of spirits, and how those ideas and spirits then help us to articulate the social conditions that we find ourselves in, right? But I agree again with Clyde Woods when he talks about our approach to Black music being a form of knowledge, right? So blues epistemology or epistemological intervention, right? So yeah, opera and classical music. But what comes up for me is Nina Simone, and how part of why she was hurt by her experience in the American music industry, and among other things, her marriage, among one of those reasons was the fact that she was not called a classical musician. This is what, this is where a lot of her energy was focused. She wanted to be called a Black classical musician. It makes me think about Leontine Price, right? Or even a Jerry Allen, who I know is in the conversation more so with jazz. But still, I'm thinking about William Still Grant, and you're right, these composers in classical music. And I'm thinking about classical music in contrast to jazz. I'm thinking about what it means that, Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane and Bobby Humphrey, right? Because I don't want to limit these conversations to being, kind of like the cishet, conversations that they have been. But I want to think about women as active creators in Black music. But, just even thinking about the fact that Black folks were pushing up against the notion of composition with their mastery of improvisation. But at the same time, when we sat the hell down and composed, something serious happened, right? So when I think of classical music, I sometimes put it in conversation with jazz. And when I'm going down your list, I'm just looking, I'm not going to go through everything. Let me just say, and then I'll let you ask another question. When coming out of Fisk University and being bombarded, I would even say, with the story of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, was really deep, because I resisted. I resisted because I felt like I heard too much of a sort of appeal for white acceptance. I was reading their approach to music as being, a legacy of slavery where Black musical forms were shamed. And I'm thinking about this in the history of Black colleges in general when I think about Amiri Baraka's pushback at Howard University because, their music department refused to acknowledge, play, study, and create scholarship around jazz, that they were focused solely on gospel, right? So I'm thinking about that interesting legacy of slavery in Black colleges, like, again, the degree to which many of our other genres have been neglected for the sake of studying, or, the old Negro spirituals and or gospel. But at the same time, I want to say that I made it through my 4 years at Fisk noticing that a lot of those students, those singers, were treated like athletes. Like, you know, they would miss class, they'd be on tour. Like, this was a massive kind of history that I was walking with. And I just remember, like, my senior year, hearing the absolute skill it took to, you know, live in those octave ranges, to be in harmony with each other, to have the discipline to understand how the body and the diaphragm works, to use the breath, to use all of those things. Like, I begin to understand something different in that. And then I also begin to understand Negro spirituals as being my first encounter with what perhaps is called Afrofuturism, right? The way that we changed those songs, the way that we used those songs to, you know, or the way that those songs were codified to communicate, you know, escape routes, like, or the way that we use those songs to envision a different tomorrow, right? Even if tomorrow never arrived, which meant we were always reaching, right? So that is a future oriented kind of music. One day we will be free. One day we'll reach the, right? Like, a lot of the lyrics are removing us from this physical place and transporting us to another place in the tomorrow. So I would even say that old Negro spirituals were my first encounter with, like, a kind of Afrofuturism or a futurism in general, a way to transcend. Um, I can stop there if you want to have any other questions or
No,
insert.
no, no. It's great. Shout out to Fisk University, who is, one of our partners for the Legacies of American Slavery. And my sister actually graduated from Fisk in the '80s, so I remember visiting campus a lot. And we recently we have a Dillard University cookbook, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. But we found in our archives, it's been sitting there for 60 years, a cookbook with all of these famous friends who gave recipes to Dillard University, because we're historically a liberal arts university. We have a music program, like a lot of HBCUs, but we, the jewel of Gentilly, and have a strong liberal arts program. And Mrs. Dent, Jessie Covington Dent, was a classic pianist and graduated from Juilliard. So music was very, and still is very important to the HBCU experience. And I think, we see that also in our street culture, when we talk about college bands, HBCU bands, so I just want to, go back to what we were talking about just coming to this world, this new world, this quote unquote new world. And, slavery begins, and just walk us through just some of your ideas about, you know, music that was created to tell the experience of slavery and how we got over.
I mean, well, the work songs and the field songs, right, is where well, actually, when Saidiya Hartman was thinking about, or I'm just thinking about her text, Lose Your Mother, and the experience of the Middle Passage. I mean, I'm curious about the music that was created or used to survive the Middle Passage, which, so even that, like, I just want to assume that folks were singing through that experience as well, you know, and just kind of imagining what those sounds were, given that people were from so many different places,
Right.
right? And speaking so many different languages, which meant having so many different sounds and rhythms and patterns, right? That experience begins before we touch this land, right? But then, yes, getting here, being introduced to Christianity and to new rhythms and to new words and to new instruments, and having our instruments removed and having our instruments or our voices or our understanding of music or religion being viewed as a threat to capital. And also viewed as a threat to productive labor, right? Is interesting to me. And it's interesting to think about it in a sort of in the when I think about the difference between, like, the British kind of colonial, but also slave driving experience versus the French one, right? Which I know we can talk about later in terms of the Congo Square and making sure the folk making sure that's interesting language and knowing the Congo Square became a legal place where we could right bring the drum and express right, but different from the
Yeah.
British folks who were threatened and who were like, no, we need these drums out of here. We don't need you to be praying on the side. We need you to right. This kind of a different kind of mean spirited, you know, overseeing that I then think forced us to work with what we had. And so using the body, you know, like, you know, thinking about slavery and thinking about Black folks as being America's kind of first technology, right, in those fields. And then what we had to do with the absence of, you know, the instruments that we knew, the songs that we knew, we had to use our bodies. We had to recall on memory. And then we had to create rhythms that would help us survive the actual workload, right? So you know, there are filmmakers like Jen and Kuru who makes this, who's a Nigerian Black British filmmaker who makes these important connections between, you know, body and rhythm and labor, body, rhythm, and labor, right? And so I think that yeah, that's what comes up for me thinking about those early work songs that were part of how we came to understand what kind of labor was being demanded of us. But also, and thinking about Portia, you know, Maltby Chart is the role that children played in the creation of music. Also, another group in our community who gets erased from being cultural producers, right? But like a lot of those, you know, child songs, those hand games were also coming out of plantation culture. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And then also, we also have the folks that were able to protect and preserve, you know, African rhythms and be able to sort of create secret societies where that music was preserved. And a lot of that happened when I think about Jamaica, right? And what was happening on the island of Jamaica and the difference there, right? Because I know that we're talking about legacies of slavery in a North American context, but because my PhD work is kind of centered on Jamaica, one of the things that I am looking at is the particular rhythms there that we're developing while we were creating field songs and work songs and kind of, you know, and old Negro spirituals and hymns and stuff is like, and what were folks creating on the islands?
Right.
And how did that then evolve to, you know, reggae and ska and all of those things? And so part of that was like, yeah, you talked about Moorish cultures, but also Maroons.
That's
What are
right.
the sounds that Maroons are making in the mountains,
Absolutely.
right? Like, because they had the British shook with
Mm,
their resistance. Queen Nanny shout out, right? They had them shook
mhm.
based on those mountain communities that oftentimes led with, centered, protected the drum.
Right. Right. And when you talk about maroon culture, bringing it to Louisiana and the bayous, you know, I see, you know, our poet, Lord, one of our famous poets in New Orleans, Kalama Yasalam. Thank you for joining us.
Oh,
Yeah.
what?
Yes, yes, yes.
What that is, I'm sorry, but let me that's now that's an honor. God.
And
Jeez, that is a walking archive. We need to just pause and say hello. That is a library in a body right there. My
indeed,
God.
indeed. Thank you for joining us. And you know, I remember having a conversation with him some years ago, and he would talk about the Maroons and how they would sassafras gumbo, you know, to survive, and
Mhm.
you know, using that one pot, and you know, in that instance, you know, when you think about music and rhythms and putting what you have available, you know, using in the space that you're in right now on the land that you're in, you know, can you talk about further just, you know, about that period? Well, I mean, we're going through, you know, we talked about what's happening in Jamaica, you know, what's happening in the Caribbean, Cuba, and even just thinking about, you know, slavery, because it wasn't you know, there were so many people from all over. And when you look
Right.
at some of the runaway slave ads, you know, the auction notices, just here in Louisiana alone, and then it lists, you know, this person, and there was no social securities back then, so security cards. So you were identified by your appearance, by the language, you spoke, also maybe the tribe you came from. So if you spoke Spanish and you were sold from Cuba, they would identify you by that. Or if you had a limp, you walked with a limp, whatever they could do to find their property, they would find you. And when you think about that, and we and even just Nago, they was list those who are Yoruba as Nago, and then they had tribal marks, so talk about just that, what you talked about, the Middle Passage and all these different languages and tribes now in this space together. And now they're on this land in the Caribbean and in the United States, and in also indigenous land. Music comes out of that. Material culture comes out of that. And the birth of, so many genres of music that is oftentimes, erased by Black people, as we're erased out of the equation for owning and creating that music until it eventually becomes, commercialized. And I mean, we're seeing with Afro beats now, so your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a specialist on that particular era, but what I know just generally, just out of respect for the music that I do love and kind of constantly looking back, is that just the word creolization comes back in hybridity, right? But also the role of religion. I'm quite, it makes me think of Santeria. It makes me think of what we were doing with those Christian rhythms, right? And how we were, reinterpreting, translating, articulating, redefining, reframing, shifting the definitions of the spiritual nature of these songs and sounds, right? In all of these different places, I also have real curiosity about the removal of voices on the continent. And therefore, what kind of music is being created then? Because I know one of the arguments around like Paul Gilroy's work and just in general, when we think about Black Atlantic, is we sometimes stop thinking about Africa.
Yep.
I'm like, well, what about the millions of people who were snatched from the continent? How did that affect the sound? How did
Absolutely.
that affect the sound, right? But also, yeah, but I'm just thinking about, what we were doing with what we have when we think about the first Black American cultural institution in the church, and how I feel like that's kind of like where my scholarship enters the room, right? It's like thinking about Black music in the Reconstruction era, which is obviously this kind of pre-blues era, or just what Alice Walker did with I guess I'm talking about early 1900s, late 19th century or late 1800s, I should say, early 20th century. But that tension between, and false binary actually, between like secular and spiritual music, or between God's music and the devil's music, like that's where my scholarship, I'm interested in that tension. Not attention. The tension is the actual attraction and the interdependence,
Gotcha.
right? So thinking about the way that we made the Black church, or had to use the Black church as a primary cultural voice and institution, and how those drums were brought to the church,
Right.
right? Because that was the first place where we could gather. Those hymns, those chants, that hymn lining, that syncopation, all of those African rhythms, right? Then passing through, the filter of Christianity. And then what happened when we were alone for the first time in the church without the white gaze, and how music changes, and then how music from there, right, is what gives us the blues. And what so that the church gives us the blues, right? And so that's why I love that part in The Color Purple where, Suge Avery and the church, the distance between the juke joint and the church. I think that was so brilliant. I hope that wasn't Steven Spielberg's idea. The space between, the short distance between the juke joint and the church is something that I'm super interested in. And I know people use this metaphor, the whole like, Saturday night, Sunday morning,
Mhm.
the black music that's created between Saturday night,
Mhm.
Sunday morning, is something that I've paid close attention with and been thinking through with folks like Samuel Floyd and James A. Cone, right? And him and his kind of rendering of thinking about the secular spirituals,
Mhm.
and just that impossible line to draw between the two.
Mm.
So that I have some work to do around my understanding of how Black music was formed between the 1600s and the 1800s. But
Gotcha.
where I feel confident entering that conversation is even thinking about the rural blues.
Mm.
Um, and I guess that then takes us to the banjo and, makes me think of Mali,
Yes.
right? And learning about this instrument that looks like, it's made a gourd instrument, a string instrument that looks like a guitar and is sort of like a descendant. Or the banjo is obviously a descendant of this. The guitar is a descendant of this. And what Black folks on the continent were doing with that and hearing the blues,
Mm.
right? In the Mali traditional songs, and I just want to shout out an amazing artist who demonstrates this and makes this link, this clear link between blues, rural blues, in the Reconstruction period and era, and Mali traditional string music, and that's Ali Fakatore. I just wanted to say him again.
Absolutely.
Passed in 2006, but
Mm.
those Africanisms are
Yeah.
interesting to me because I'm like, oh, the blues, the blues impulse
Mm.
and connecting the blues to Africa is something that I think we need to do more of.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
so again, you have the blues and the guitar and the banjo, but then you have a descendant of the banjo in the church called the tambourine.
Mm.
Right? So
Camera.
so these right, so all of this stuff is in conversation, these fusions, this integration, this merging, and what emerges from,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
This social period is just like, yeah, these different genres of music and the way that it gets articulated in these different ways based on what we're dealing with. Because what is the soundtrack for convict leasing? What's
Right.
the soundtrack for the Black codes? What
Right.
were the lyrics to some of the songs when white folks were writing up their Black codes?
Mm.
Like, how did we respond?
Mhm.
Because I do feel like when we comb through lyrics, like we find those histories.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes we find those histories in instrumentals.
Mhm. That
Who,
was profound. What you just said. That was profound on what you said. What did you want to say? You said who, what now?
oh, somebody asked if a name can be typed in the chat. Oh, Ali Fakatore?
Sure.
I might be Oh, it's Torde though. But anyway, yeah. So so that's where a lot of the work is, and but even then, right? So as we speak, I'm writing a book on, and I'm sorry, are we on track here? I know I'm going a lot of different
No,
places.
we have until 7:30, so we have about 45 minutes, and hopefully we'll have enough time for questions and answers. And just, thank everyone for joining us this evening in this conversation. We greatly appreciate your support. This is a long conversation that we're going to have over, the next 2 years. And
That's
so
great.
we encourage you all to also just, I'll send you a link to our Dillard Ray Charles to previous talks and our film series by our students. So thank you for joining us this evening as we're in conversation with DJ Lynnee Denise. And I had the opportunity to see her when she came to New Orleans, and she was a guest speaker and guest DJ for the Amistad Research Center. And I think I might have sprained my muscle from dancing. You were amazing. So, I wanted to make sure that we brought you back for this
Thank
project.
you so much, because that was years ago, and you reached out years later, and I was like, no, that's a beautiful full circle. So thank you for
Yes.
that. I also want to shout out Marilyn Gross because, and listen, the Gandhi dancers, listen, okay. I watched a number of those videos. For those of you who don't know, the Gandhi dancers were, man, talk about work and labor and the body again, working on the railroad and creating these songs, right? But what I would have my students look at and ask themselves
Mm.
is what would happen to those train tracks they were moving if one person was off beat.
Mm, talk about it.
What?
Come
You
on.
want to talk about the one and what George Clinton refers to as the one, or maybe the universe, the cosmic one, the
Right.
black one, the black one, and landing on the one
Mm,
so that we can create the infrastructure for this country, that our rhythm is directly related to the infrastructure of this country. Shout
mm.
out to the Gandhi dancers. Thank you very much for saying that. Um, but yeah, I'm currently writing a book on Willie Mae Thornton.
Oh, wow.
Um, it's been a journey because there's only one book that's been written about her, and someone spelled it. It's Gandy, Gandhi dancers, Gandy.
Mm,
They have a number of videos on YouTube, and listen, not
mm,
a game, not a game to see them in action and to think about the importance of rhythm and infrastructure and racialized capitalism and black bodies as technology and the one. Anyway, so writing this book on Willie Mae taught me so much about the vaudeville movement,
right.
right? Movement is an interesting word, but really the role that black women have played in creating the multi-billion-dollar music industry. The
Mm,
multi-billion-dollar music industry, and that often they get erased from the origin story of America's music industry. And a lot of my work deals with the music industry as a kind of neo-plantation, if I'm honest, that kind of gives me a sharecropping model, right?
mm,
When I think about one of the last things, say for example, that that Donny Hathaway said to James Ntume before he jumped out of a window
mm.
was, I think that they're trying to get me, Ntume. They are trying to hook me up to machines and take my music.
Wow.
So I've been thinking about this long, long history of exploiting black folks, of paying some of those convict leases, paying the chain gang folks, going into the prisons and paying them with alcohol,
Right.
having them sign contracts that were obviously exploitive
Mm,
based on the power imbalance. I'm thinking about the Alan Lomaxes, right? I'm thinking about the number of sort of so-called
yes.
field recorders that went into these prisons and did this dirty work and really extended the plantation model. But I'm also thinking about black women and labor and music, and not just as vocalists but as musicians. Willie Mae Thornton did so much more than get robbed by Elvis, right? That she was a harmonica player, that she was a damn drummer, right? That she, like Mahalia Jackson, understood a fierce clap, as an extension of the tambourine and coming out of the church.
Absolutely.
But I'm just thinking about all these young black girls who were leaving home at the age of 13 and 14, right? And they were musical migrant workers,
Right.
and they get erased from the blues history. I'm like, wait,
Yeah.
oh my God, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith,
Mm,
Alberta Hunter, Victoria Speaking, Memphis Minnie. These women there are just the legends and the legacies and the genealogies of blues women that extends beyond them as vocalists with gowns on, but thinks about them as being musical migrant workers who were the first to be recorded by
mm,
the
mm,
American music industry, the
mm,
first to be recorded,
mm, mm.
right? So I just wanted to pause with there because I think it's very easy to continue to talk about black music and center black men,
Yeah.
or to talk about black women solely based on their voices. So
Right.
I am a music activist, and that I want us to remember
Mm,
that Aretha Franklin
mm,
was one of the best pianists. I
mhm.
want us to think about, Patrice Rushen as an amazing pianist and composer. I want us to think about Memphis Minnie and Rosetta Tharpe, right? I want us to think about, of course, Nina Simone. She didn't want to sing at first, so I want us to do more with black women, and yes, as cultural workers, as cultural producers, and as people who are creating genres of music, not just participating as accessories and vocalists, which is also a form of musicianship, right? I'm not even trying to, you know, um, disregard the importance of the voice as an instrument, perhaps one of the first, right? But yeah, I'm kind of going all over the place. I'm just
No, you're
thinking about
good.
all of these things, you know, we also need to be queering Black music.
Yeah.
And that came to me, you know, thinking about Little Richard and his recent passing, but also learning about the straight up queer base of the Chitlin circuit.
Yes.
The
Yes.
queer base of the Chitlin circuit, right? And the blues women who went on the record and said, pay it forward. I'm trying to be with her. You know, all these blues prison themed songs that came out of, you know, even, you know, Bessie Smith's catalog. There's a song, I think it's just called The Prison Blues, where she's like, I'm totally paraphrasing this reference, but she says this lyric, she says something to the degree of like, I'm in this cell, so do me a favor and send me another lady in here. You know what I mean? I'm just like, no, this has been a part of our, this is not about like, oh, house music is the entry point to where queer folks enter the conversation. I'm just saying, like, we have always been queer, women have always been involved, right? It's always been a collective effort. Children are a part of that effort, you know, like, and you know, just important that I'm totally giving you like tangents here. I hope you all are following me. This is literally
This is amazing.
a mixtape approach. This I'm like, new song, next song, new song. But hopefully you understand the whole, right? It's a collage, this Black music thing. And I just pull from different sources. So I'm thinking about Little Richard, you know, he's like, he considers himself to be, you know, shamelessly the architect of rock and roll. But you ask him his influence, sis, and one of the first he says is Mahalia Jackson. You're like, but what do you mean? Of course he comes out of the Black church. But what that made me do is go back and study Mahalia in a very different way. Because of course, whether she would admit it or not, she's one of the greatest blues musicians. Okay? Come on, Mahalia. I know you didn't want to say it. Also, we know that based on testimony, there's so many videos and documentaries about her life that I sat with during the pandemic that she would listen to Bessie secretly. You know, like
a lot of people were listening to, you know, Ma Rainey, all of them.
Come on. But Mahalia, I say that secretly because she was publicly vocal about her distance from, from the blues, even though I'm like, but Mahalia Thomas Dorsey is a blues. You are Ma Rainey. Y'all together are okay, sure, put Jesus's name in it. Absolutely. But I hear the blues. But I bring that to you to think about, you know, Mahalia Jackson, yes, is one of the greatest gospel musicians. Yes, is one of the greatest blues musicians, but also one of the greatest rock musicians. Because if you watch the 1958 Newport Jazz Festival where she reluctantly performs with Louis Armstrong, right? Because you're at a jazz festival, Mahalia. If you watch that video, she has on a long light blue dress with a white sort of, you know, some like embroidered something in the middle. And she sings, I think, Elijah Rock. And I'm going to tell you something right now. This rock style, the grabbing the mic, the sweat on the hair in the back, like she's giving you Black rock. Which is why I understand Little Richard was like, she is the architect for me. I am the architect. However, she's the blueprint, you know, like, and, you know, so I'm just thinking about, so if you all are able to go and find Portia Maltby's chart, you'll notice that she created two, right? She creates one with very straight lines, folk gospel, hymns, you know, gospel in the golden age. I'm thinking about, you know, just the Caravans and the James Cleveland and all those folks. You know, the Dixie Hummingbirds, you know, all of those folks, the Davis sisters, Sam Cooke, the Soul Star, and all of that, right? But then she comes back, reorganizes the chart, and creates all these lines that are hard to connect. Like you cannot. So it is your job to understand the connection between go-go, bounce, and, you know, Houston R&B, but there is a connection, right? And it's also your job. So what's not on that chart that I'd like to add on that chart is to understand the relationship between ska and the fact that a lot of these sound system DJs had access to American radio and or albums through the Black American soldiers who were sometimes stationed there and traveled with their records, and they are listening closely to who? New Orleans music.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
New Orleans music. So that means I'm listening to ska and I'm like, I'm hearing Roscoe Gordon. I'm
Huh.
hearing I'm hearing I'm hearing rhythm and blues in
Right.
ska that I hadn't heard before. And I only was able to hear it because someone did scholarship around those connections. And
Yeah.
that's a deep thing because I did not hear the Black South in Jamaican 1950s ska, but it turns out they were listening to a lot of folks from Memphis and Houston and
Yeah.
New Orleans. So now when I listen to ska, I'm like, oh,
Right.
right? Like, that's an interesting thing. So, I mean, I think that so that her kind of redesigning that chart and making it very impossible to locate the origin. We come back to this, the impossibility of the origin story of Black music or Black Atlantic music or Black music in the afterlife of slavery. It's impossible to reach the origin, which for a DJ couldn't be more exciting. I will never reach my destination, which means the dance floor will always be fed,
Mm.
right? I will always be digging.
Okay, so let me, since you live between London and Amsterdam, and you are part of, this the African American experience in Europe today in the 21st century. I want to kind of go back to World War One and James Reese Europe. Because
Okay.
here in the United States, unfortunately, we always kind of focus on World War II and
Yeah,
not
we.
enough on World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And when France and Europe, had a celebration marking the anniversary of the World War II,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there was programming out there. I'm not taking away from anyone who had any programming out there
Yeah.
with museums, etc. But
Mm-hmm.
James Reese Europe,
Mm-hmm.
going to taking jazz to the world and to Europe, you
Mm-hmm.
know, it really, but it really changed, made African American music culture um spread to the world, because African American music is American culture.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And so to be able for him to take this band, and create this sound, and one of the largest funerals after he died, happened in New York, miles and miles of people, just um there for his death. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I know very little about that. I can talk about that period in terms
Yeah,
of.
that period. I want to talk about migration specifically, and jazz and blues, and how it migrated to Europe, and how it, migrated up north when, during the Great Migration, when people started moving, and then moving into other genres of music, you know, that's what I would like to talk.
No, totally. I mean, migration in Europe. I mean, so, that takes me back to Fisk and them being the first to kind of perform in Europe and being part of this kind of introduction to Black American music. But then, yeah, thinking about World War One in that period, 1914, 1918, on the hills of ragtime, but also this kind of like syncopated brass band sound and the top of sort of like, yeah, New Orleans jazz actually, right? So and I think that like what is interesting about migration in the context of Europe and jazz musicians is this, and I think, and now I need to think about when Josephine Baker was there. I
Mm,
think that might be a little later, maybe 1930s.
mhm,
So that is getting into that World War II.
mhm.
Um, Sorry,
Right.
I'm looking at the comments. That World War II era, but yeah, that 19 that pre, or I guess that World War One period, and jazz and migration and the European reach into Black American communities and bringing folks over. Yeah, that certainly was the beginning and tells you the history of why all these jazz musicians, Quincy Jones, Miles Davis, which I know is way later, but like talking about what it meant to be fully seen and or heard.
I mean, and you think about women, so Sarah Vaughan and all of them who, yeah, yeah. Mhm.
No, totally Sarah Vaughan, Ella, certainly Ella
Yep.
and Sarah Vaughan. I mean, what's the trip though is that, is that I can't think of a single, woman musician. There is. I'm trying to think about a certain, but because most of what comes to my head is post World War II. But yeah, I mean, I think that Europe has had a serious, I want to call it a love affair, but an interesting kind of investment in Black American jazz in particular, and also makes me think about the number of children that were born in that context, like the number of jazz folks that traveled there, stayed there, married white women, and had children. But I mean, because that's also part of the history and the story and the color of the sound and the. But yeah, I mean, I think that starting from that World War I era, including the Black folks who were on those front lines and bringing their instruments, and that being part of the migration, right, is like Black folks in the war fighting these wars, but also bringing their instruments, bringing their sounds, bringing, it's just an interesting period. Again, I'm not super versed. I am much more versed on the post-war World War II
Mhm.
era, but I just think about it in terms of what New Orleans gave us, right? In terms of the brass instrument as a centerpiece of, okay, listen, I
I think
feel like the room needs to sit still.
you.
Because yes,
Yes, thank you.
Armstrong, absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, but I'd be curious, like, who else comes to mind, Kalamu, in terms of that World War I big brass band, New Orleans syncopated jazz era,
Mhm.
if you're there? Because I don't have much on it, on that 1914. It's interesting that these years are very specific, right? Because
Mhm.
I'm I can talk to you about that 1940s bebop movement.
Talk about it then. Let's talk about the bebop movement. And please, everyone who, who's interested in, asking questions, to please add your question to the Q&A. I'm going
Yeah.
to, in about 5 minutes, we're going to start opening it up for Q&A. So please add your questions to the Q&A. But talk
But
about
also,
bebop.
Kalamu, I just want to mention that Kalamu just mentioned, and I want to say her name, and he's right. Sure, absolutely, Sydney, absolutely that time. Mary Lou Williams, though.
Uh-huh. Mary Lou Williams. Absolutely. And I mean,
Um,
the birth of jazz and the end of Storyville, right? That's how,
yeah,
yeah.
no,
Okay.
absolutely.
So you talk about bebop, let's
You
talk about
know,
bebop. Let's talk
nice.
about it.
No, so I mean, well, really, I'm going back to Jamaica, and I'm thinking about, the number of Black American jazz musicians who traveled there to play at the resorts that were oftentimes white only resorts. Um, yeah, certainly. I'm thinking of Hazel Scott, but again, this is later on down the line. Um, Kalamu was talking about the history of women jazz pianists, and yeah. So yeah, just that bebop era. I mean, I'm thinking about like Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, and I mean, see these names that come up. When I think of, I'd be curious of what comes up for Kalamu in terms of Black women bebop jazz musicians,
Mhm.
right? Because that is absolutely. I think Angela Davis is currently working on a book about um, jazz as a patriarchal site, which is really important. And especially since I learned, certainly Hazel Scott, especially since I learned so much from her about the blues and her blues legacies and Black feminism text, right? Is that now she is going into the crates of jazz history to try to find, to excavate, the names of these women, because of course we do exist. But
Yes.
yeah, this bebop era, a kind of rebellion against
Mhm.
swing jazz, against big band jazz, against the kind of commercialization of jazz and the kind of taming
Mhm.
down of jazz, right? And pushing towards this abstract,
Mhm.
composition heavy, but also improvisational heavy music that represents migration again, right? When I think of bebop, I'm thinking of the Vanguard. I'm thinking of like these New York clubs. I'm thinking of the role that New York played in the development of these of this genre. And like I tell my students, even I know you're from Chicago. I think there is something to be said about how in Amiri Baraka's blues people kind of gives me the tools I need to think about this, right? The ways in which jazz evolves from blues, right? Different elements of the blues that show up in jazz. But one thing that I'm always curious about, even in terms of tempo, right? And how when we get to bebop, and yeah, there is an emphasis on improvisation, but also the solo player, right? But also tempo and weather, tempo and New York weather, right? And the difference between the tempo of blues in the Black South in a different climate, in a different environment, and how that sounds, right? And why is bebop sped up? What is the idea? What are the conditions that create this faster sound is interesting to me. How much of it is connected to the disappointment in arriving in the North only to realize, right, that the white supremacy wore a different face, right? How did that affect how they sat down? Because Miles was arrested, but then also the role of heroin, right?
Oh,
And
yeah, talk
and,
about it.
and bebop, right? And how that and now we're talking about the bebop era, then we need to talk about, Billie Holiday. And,
Yes.
and I don't want to talk about Billie Holiday in the context of drugs. I want to talk about Billie Holiday and the work that pianists had to do to match her sound, right? And that she too could be, I think, someone who is considered a bebop artist to some degree, or certainly part of the climate that produced it. Um, I'm thinking about finally, Lindy hopping and dance, Black social dance during that era. Now, of course, I'm not thinking about bebop and dance as much,
Right.
but I'm just thinking about Black social dance space as well around that time. And I do say Lindy hopping on purpose, thinking about, I always remember that Malcolm X was a dancer.
Absolutely.
Malcolm X was a dancer. I guess like Farrakhan is a singer. Like that's interesting, right? Um, yeah, I mean, I'm just going a bunch of places. Later on in the 1950s, with the beginning of the civil rights movement and how we move into hard bop and how Coltrane and them are kind of pushing up against the restrictive nature of white jazz criticism. Oh, you think that bebop is inaccessible? Well, let me give you this 29-minute song.
Right.
And let me actually change the show. No, it's not written. It's a solo, which means I'm computing math on the spot. It means I'm a mathematician or it means that I've become a channel, right? Like that I am actually speaking with multiple voices. There are multiple voices coming through this horn. If I can play a 20-minute unwritten composition, right? And push up against magazines like Downbeat that tried to, shame jazz musicians for being quote unquote inaccessible or for linking the music to the struggle. And so, it makes me think about, yeah, it makes me think about two things: the fact that Amiri Baraka was really pushing Black people to write about Black music,
Yeah.
but also what Kalamu said, which was that um, Sarah Vaughan being a pianist, which I only recently learned, right? When I was doing a deep dive on Sarah Vaughan, and I was like, she, in the middle of her, so she's like, hold on, she was guiding the piano player, like, can you play a little blues? And he was like, well, not really. And she looked like, well, hold on, let me show you. And I was like, Sarah, what? Betty Carter, one of
Right.
my favorite musicians, Um, yeah, so maybe we can just get into questions.
Yeah, let's get into questions. Some of you all, if you all can put your questions. Someone said should mention Como drum and Fife for early music.
That was Kalamu still, and
Okay.
because now I'm thinking about, yeah, I'm just looking at all of Kalamu's statements, but yeah, I don't know about Como drum and
Hmm.
540 music, but yeah, come on now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And these, now we're getting to kind of like the electronic music. I'm gonna give everybody a second to ask questions. So once again, please think of your questions and put them in the chat box. Should
That's good. Electronic music, that's great.
uh and just your journey of becoming a DJ, because I'm the part of this program, and just speaking on behalf of the Ray Charles program in African American material culture, and Ray Charles, bringing it back to Ray Charles and just how
Hmm.
he
Sure.
owned music, broke so many barriers and really didn't break barriers, but in mainstream America, and in mainstream America, they were shocked that he's playing country music or putting out a country album when it's part of our culture as well. um I want to talk about just you becoming this DJ scholarship and the scholarship behind what you're doing, and those students who are listening finding voice and scholarship in our culture.
Yeah. You know, hmm, I'm in this interesting place because I just had a chance to see the Michael Jackson musical on Broadway,
Mhm.
which sent me to an interesting place to think about electronic music, or maybe the ways in which folks like Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson shaped me. You know, in my mind, I'm more of a dancer than my actual body, right? But you know, in my mind, I'm really in there. You know, like, but in reality, you know, what I was thinking about Michael Jackson is like he's another person who didn't know how to read music, but
Mm,
then he's out here producing people, and you know, and thinking about how he would beatbox for the bass play. I wanted to go like this, right? I'm like, what did my, and then the bass, oh, you mean, right? And picking that up,
right.
and I'm like, oh, again, you know, that is who shaped my sensibility,
Sure.
you know, and then of course, so I think I came into DJ culture through dance, you
Mm,
know, because I mean, once I started to do my own deep dive around Michael and Janet's roots as dancers, I landed at the LA Pop Lockers,
mm,
you
mm,
know, and then and which took me to Soul Train, which
right.
took me to Chicago. Then I had to think about Chicago and LA and that migration, how literally once I learned that Soul Train started in Chicago,
Right.
when in the mornings, when on Saturday mornings, when I would see that funky train
And
as a part of the theme,
mhm.
I started to think that that train had come from Chicago, right? I was, as a kid, I remember being like, because I remember hearing adults in my family be like, well, you know, that started in Chicago. And so
Mm,
I was thinking like, oh, that funky train got here from Chicago. You know, like, and
right.
this truth of it though, right,
Right.
is that we are talking about migration and train routes from Chicago, right? I'm
Right.
thinking about even Ray Charles, who ended up, you know, from Seattle to LA and all this migration stuff. So I came in through DJ culture, through dance culture, and learning about folks like Jeffrey Daniels and,
Mm,
you know, you know, even Fred Berry from I know we know him from I was gonna say Good Times, from What's Happening, and so there is a quote that I'm gonna paraphrase again, right? And it comes from I believe Samuel Floyd again and his book called The Power of Black Music. And
mhm,
I tweeted this one day because I came across this line like, are you serious? He says that genre is created by Black dancers,
mm,
right? And
mm,
so I'm thinking about what I feel as a DJ when I'm looking out, my accountability to the dance floor, but then also how, like, yeah, dance shapes the DJ, dance shapes the sound,
mm,
right? And that there is that's another place it's hard to tell where the genre begins and the dance move begins or ends, right? So I came in through it through dance, but
mm.
then I want to say, you know, electronic music. I feel like, you know, Herbie Hancock,
Yes.
not just Rocket, but he has another song called Nobu.
Mm.
That if you, I wish that I had my turntables, and I wish we would have maybe decided, you know, I could have showed you examples of it.
Oh, we'll have part two, and this is a long, the grandest, for some more extended time. So we will definitely invite you back for that.
Yeah,
And we would
because
love
I
that.
think
Thank you.
the musical samples would be, because I'm like, how can I talk about this and you can't hear it? But Herbie Hancock, but then of course Rocket,
Yeah.
right? Rocket and the demand that Black folks be represented on MTV is part of what. Once I could see us, once I started seeing us, then
Yeah.
I became more clear that I had a role to play because I like the music so much. I memorize the music so much. I have such an intimate relationship with the music. But then I also realized I was being shaped by the masters like Stevie Wonder, who was
Right.
a phenomenal electronic musician, like Herbie Hancock, who
Yes.
was also always pushing the piano and pushing and reaching for synthesizers. And let me say this because Kalamu said it several times,
Mhm.
much like Sun Ra in the 60s,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Prior to obviously House, but I mean, but also a legacy, but House is an offspring,
Mhm.
right? Of Thomas Dorsey's blues and Sun Ra's, you know, electronic piano in Chicago. So when
Absolutely.
Sun Ra migrated from Alabama
Mhm.
to Chicago, you know, like he became part of the soundscape, which ended up shaping the grandparents or the great grandparents of those who were then producing house,
Right.
right?
Right.
But I also want to say, so that's Herbie Hancock as an electronic musician. That is Stevie Wonder is one of the greatest, you know,
Mhm.
electronic musicians, and then Prince.
Oh man. Yeah.
Electronic musicians
Yeah.
that shaped house music, that shaped hip hop music, that shaped techno music, right? That you don't have Detroit techno without the Minneapolis sound,
Right.
you know? And so
And something about what you said, the weather and being in those spaces, I can remember going to the warehouse in Chicago. I can remember going to these legendary places, Medusas, back in the day, where these spaces, you would come out before there was technology, and everyone was in their phone. You would come out knowing that you're going to be drenched. You're leaving everything on that floor.
I'm
And
jealous.
and just that weather pushing everybody into warmer spaces,
That,
suppose against New Orleans second line culture, which you
yes,
take to the
House
streets,
North.
you know?
That's great. That's a great, you know, connection. And I just want to, you know, give love to Ron Hardy. Yes, Frankie Knuckles, but Frankie Knuckles
Mhm.
wasn't from Chicago. That's great. It's amazing that he is considered to be one of the, you know, founding people of house, and he is. But I just want, but like Ron Hardy and the
Yes,
Music Box, these
yes.
are things that I wish that I could be part. You know, I'm like, what Ron Hardy was doing too is it doesn't get the same kind of attention. And
Somebody said
yeah, someone just said, let's not forget that Prince and Beyonce's grandparents are from Louisiana,
absolutely.
as were James Baldwin's. I
As
mean, we
Jay-Z's Jay-Z, came from his family came from Louisiana as well.
and mine,
Yeah.
my folks, you know, like especially, come on, I'm Californian, so you know, I was like, Mama, Keisha and them have gumbo down the street, you know, and like, here's a bowl,
Yes.
okay, you know? But yeah, so I came into you know, Prince. I just want to get back to that, and maybe we can wrap up here. I don't know. We have like
Yes,
10
we have
minutes.
about 9 minutes.
Yeah,
So
because
yeah.
there are no questions so far, but and I want to give a shout out to my own city, LA, and the world class wrecking crew and the Uncle Jam's Army,
Mm,
the DJ crews that came out of Los Angeles that prided themselves in their link to Funkadelic, you
mm,
know,
mm.
to the Funkadelic empire, to the not P Funk even as much as Funkadelic, or not Parliament as much as Funkadelic, but that link between LA culture and then this Midwest, you know, even though George Clinton is from Jersey, but then, you know, finds his way, you know, Bootsy and them are from Ohio. And, you know, I'm always thinking about music and place. And then what happens when young Black kids in LA get that sound that came to us from the Midwest, you know, and thinking about why I became a DJ because of what I felt when the local DJs in my community play Zap More Bounce,
Mm, mm, mm.
or when who is it? Is it Shirley Murdoch? Who was it? I can't think of if it was Shirley Murdoch. Hold on, we're gonna get to this question. Okay, I'm gonna get. That's good. It's the first question.
Okay.
You know, computer love, just you
Yeah.
know. So electronic music beyond house, because house music and techno music were not heard on LA radio stations, right? So I was just listening to Zapp and Roger and a lot of East Coast rap, and
Right.
but it was just teaching me something. Hip hop was teaching me something about cultural production and critical consciousness,
Hmm.
right? So like it was Chuck D, it was MC Light, it was Queen Latifah, it was like especially Queen Latifah's first album. It was NWA. Well, it was like Ice Cube's first few albums that taught me to read critically.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm like, oh wait, so you guys are writing rhymes, writing, reading critically. So you're telling me that reading critically is a part of this kind of like practice, this hip hop culture making. And
Yeah.
that's how I entered it. I entered it because of like Poor Righteous Teachers and Gangstar. Shout out to, the
So,
Guru and DJ Premier. Just even NWA saying fuck the police was important to
right.
my practice. But more importantly, learning that Dr. Dre had been sampling. What is this thing called sampling? Oh, well, then that's the beginning of an investigative practice because now I have to go and find the originals. And then once I find the originals, I'm going to start reading the liner notes, but also studying the album covers, right?
Right.
So then it's a whole experience. So then I'm like, oh, well, my parents have a whole range of albums that I hear DJs and rappers rhyming over. So wait a minute. Well, then let me look closely at these Ohio Player album covers. Let me look closely at these Funkadelic and Parliament album covers that have a whole cosmology, a whole visual language. So I just kept learning about, the relationship between research, investigation, and chasing samples and digging through the crates. I realized that they were all metaphors for us having an intellectually rigorous cultural practice. So someone said, how difficult is it as a musician channel diasporic to channel something in real time? How difficult is it as a musician diasporic? I wonder if they can ask that question. What advice would you give to a student with no background in music who's interested in production? Yes, absolutely. Pedro Bell, rest in peace, who died recently. So, Michaela has a question. I'm not clear about the question you're asking. The first one.
But
Um,
I think she might be, I think she might be asked, I think she's trying to ask, just how do you start if you don't have this, you know, rich background in music. So where do you start as, to become a DJ and to, I guess, delve into, this, in the diaspora and
mhm,
sound.
mhm. I mean, you have to leave America mentally first in terms of diaspora because it's so one of the things that the first place was a close listening practice. The first thing, so to get into your second question, Michaela, am I pronouncing their name correctly?
Yes.
Michaela, you say, can you go into sampling and crate digging? Well, that's directly related to how I started. Like I said, like it tripped me out that I would be hearing this music and I would fall in love with the music. I was like, this is the best music I have heard. And my dad would come in and be like, you mean James Brown, 1977 funky drummer? I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, this is our generation, but you don't know nothing about. And then he would pull out the album like, you trying to tell me that this song has a 50-year history?
Right. Right.
Like, what? So it was literally my intellectual curiosity around the music and unlearning Black music solely as a form of entertainment and thinking about it as a discipline, like someone would sociology, like someone would psychology, like Black music as a discipline. And so that requires me to listen closely. So
Hmm.
part of that for me meant having my finger near the recording button on the radio in the 80s and pushing record.
Yep.
Once I would record for a whole night, I might spend the next day in my room transcribing lyrics. Once I transcribe those lyrics, I would review them over and over again. Then I would take those rhymes, they were not my rhymes, I would take those rhymes onto the playground and battle other folks who have been doing the same thing.
What? And make your own mixtape because you got the double cassette player.
No, come on now. Come on.
And
Exactly.
wait for that late night radio station, to come on so
Yeah.
you can get that mix. So, and
No,
just, I mean, what you're talking about is so profound and just that practice, and
it's a
then moving it
practice.
forward to today, and just the, you know, social media, YouTube, the visuals,
Oh
moving
God,
from TV to, someone like
endless.
in hip hop is endless.
Endless.
but it's
Endless.
also, just talking about hip hop and you talking about just that the visual being able to hold that album cover,
Yes.
it being a piece of art. What are your thoughts about just where we're headed with music? I mean, NFTs are coming out, so much coming out with music, and just where we're headed in the next phase of music. And I'm going to ask Leah. Leah, I'm going to ask your question. I just had to, throw that question in.
Oh,
Talking
okay.
about Afrofuturism.
Okay, well, I want to acknowledge something that Kalamu said as well in terms of how do you get there to the practice. And he said, go see people dance. And that's what I'm saying. It started for me. My entry point were dancers.
Yes,
That kind of body intelligence.
yes,
I have a lot of, I look to the dancers to make sure that I'm doing well.
absolutely.
So now I lost your question.
Oh,
Uh,
about the future,
oh, the
Afrofuturism,
future of music based.
NFTs,
Okay.
and music, and just
Yeah.
when I think about Afro beats, and I was listening to a song. I'm gonna see, Burna Boy soon in Madison Square Garden, and I was thinking about just Justin Bieber now, on the song for Afro beats, and just this new genre, and then it's not a new genre, but the Africanization now of this genre coming into the United States. I mean, of course, it's been in London. Of course, it's been in Europe. Because there's a huge Nigerian population. But now with the advent with social media and being able to share music so quickly and culture and dance and all of this, and seeing other cultures just be able to pick it up. You don't have to wait for someone to migrate somewhere to
Mm,
actually learn,
yeah.
now you're able to, you know what I mean? So you're curious about your thoughts of the future of music as a DJ, as a scholar. Where are we headed?
Yeah, that's great that you said you said something profound, which is that we don't have to wait for people to migrate. Listen,
Hmm.
that's I just want to pause with that because I have a series. Okay, so I can answer that in a full. Okay, so I have a series called the Afrodigital Migration, and it's a series of it's a compilation of house music in South Africa, right? And that is because, I'm deeply in love with Winnie Mandela. I'm deeply in love with Miriam Makeba. I'm deeply in love with Steve Biko, right? And so then I started to pay a lot more, Hugh Masekela, I started to pay a lot more attention, Kwaito music. But when I was thinking about Afro digital migration, I was thinking about how we no longer have to wait for people to migrate because, right, these digital forms of music, and that includes CDs in this case, and also MP3s and cassette tapes, right? Or these different ways, these different formats that make it possible for the music to travel ahead of people, right? That then contributes to the local sound. So the Afro digital migration is very much so about that. It's about how we have shifted the way that we can hear each other diasporically, right? That we can now communicate across borders in this very different way. So I think when I think about the future of music, interestingly enough, I think of South Africa um, as a place that I hope that I know, just because if you all are not familiar with the Afro digital migration, please go and check out. This is not a plug for my work, but I have a compilation of South African house music from different eras, from starting from like 2012 to now. There's a new style of house music called Amapiano, and
Yes,
it is
yes, yes,
global.
yes,
It's
yes.
global. It's
Talk
deep.
about yeah,
It's deep. It
yes.
includes the organ. It
Hmm.
includes the black church.
Hmm.
I mean, but also it's created in a post-apartheid context. And more importantly, when you think about the future, it also holds the story of the pandemic, right?
Hmm.
Because it is about the number of young people who were forced to shelter in place
Hmm.
and the amount of Amapiano music that
Hmm.
was created in these townships.
Wow.
So when we talk about the Omicron variant started in South Africa and all these super racialized, super racist kind of, this super racialized and racist discourse around public health and Black folks spreading disease.
Mhm.
It's interesting that during that time in those townships, some of the most important Black diasporic music was being created,
Mm,
and
mm,
it's electronic music.
mm,
Go and listen to Amapiano. I think that that truly is I think that the future, I hope, is a deeper engagement of Black diasporic music, which is why Afro beats is blowing up. But I
yes,
do hope that we do find out about Fela Kuti and other women in the original Afro beats movement at that. But
Kiba,
but I hope that the
South
future
Africa.
is a diasporic. I hope that the future is about curiosity in the African diaspora and the electronic music in particular that folks are creating. Because when we think about the history of race and technology and white supremacy and the way that white supremacy attempts to separate and detach Black people from technology, when in fact we have created some of the most sophisticated music using technology, it's
Mm,
important to know what kind of musical work Black folks are doing on the continent, a place that we have not allowed to be thought about as, a place that is technologically savvy.
mm, 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 mm. But here, I mean, but with the phone, phones now and on the continent, the access to Instagram, YouTube, and being able, I mean, being able to create so much music and and really transport and push it out into the world in this digital space, and when you talk about dance, when you talk to I mean, you see on TikTok, people doing different dances that are, coming from the continent, dances even, here in New Orleans. I mean, we're in New Orleans, you see, uh, recently we had Second Line Shorty who was invited to Paris,
Listen, she's
you
a
know
beast.
what I mean?
She's a beast.
And being able to share that, so I mean, this, and it's giving also opportunity, I think, to some of people who normally had to wait or go through an agent or all these other things, and now real time people are saying, hey, come this way. So it's a very powerful and pivotal, and we're in an axial age, I think, and this conversation is so profound, so profound, and I know that we're going to continue conversations like this later. Leah, I would love to answer your question. I am going to follow up. We would love to answer your questions, but I think, some of the new genres, I mean, she wants to find out what are some contemporary artists you might, I guess, recommend. You talked about music from South Africa, and yeah, I think that's what she's trying to ask. Okay.
So I also want to acknowledge Marissa Montana's shout
Okay.
out to South African own music, is own music
Okay.
coming out of Durban. Absolutely, that's another form of South African house music.
Nice.
Um, the major centers of music production are USA, Brazil, London. I was just looking at because of the Black folks. Absolutely, South America, South Africa, Black South. But yes, absolutely, and even South London, the global South. you know,
Right. Right.
some contemporary artists. There's an amazing one of my favorite artists right now, Kia,
Okay.
Keiyaa. I think, and I've told her personally. I wonder if she's on this as a member, but she is. I'll put her name in the
Thank you.
in the clap, but she is. I mean, she's just something else. And she's also from Chicago. She lives in Brooklyn. She is a Black woman, electronic music producer and singer, and just doing really interesting stuff with sampling. And she has one of the best albums
Mm,
um, that that I've spent time with.
mhm.
Contemporary is so deep. I'm very much like it because right now I'm in a late 1960s, early 1970s Black nationalist jazz phase.
Right.
But like say for example, one of some of my favorite rappers in the UK are like Lil Sims and Skepta.
I love Skepta. Mhm.
Yeah, Skepta is something else, but also Lil Sims is
Oh, of
listen.
course, of course.
Um, I'm trying to content. I
Well,
mean, that's who comes to mind.
take your time. I mean, we could always, I have everyone's email who signed up, and we could always come back with a list if you have time, just of some musicians that you recommend. That would be nice. But this was such a profound conversation, out of time, and respect for everybody's time. And I know some of us are on different time zones, so, and out of respect for your time, we truly, truly appreciate this conversation.
No, thank you for inviting me. It was great.
Yes, it was great. And thank you everyone who Kia, someone said Kia should come to New Orleans. Yes, indeed.
She's a,
um,
I'm just telling you, she's a
that
great
would be amazing. That
giant.
would be amazing. So we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel for Dillard University Ray Charles program. DJ Lynnee Denise, we thank you so much for joining us this evening for this high level conversation about music, migration, slavery. It's so much to talk about, and it's a huge, it just opens up so many crates.
It does open up a lot of crates. No, thank you so much.
Thank,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to another conversation.
Absolutely. And we would love to invite you again to come to Dillard and, spin or whatever, that would be amazing. So thank you for all the work that you do. And we're looking forward to your book and anything that you put out. And we encourage everyone to follow DJ Lynnee Denise on Instagram, Twitter, just to keep abreast with what she's doing, because she does incredible work. And, just to even watch you during, COVID, in Amsterdam and going
Mhm.
on, and that you were able to continue. So we thank you for just your light and being a part of this experience and material culture and
Thank
preserving
you.
it and living it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again to you guys and to Ray Charles and to Kalamu, because that was an honor too. Just a New Orleans welcome. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. And once again, this is part of the Council of Independent Colleges, a generous grant for the Legacies of American Slavery. So we definitely wanted to thank them for this series of talks and our film series. And we have some great programming coming soon, and a virtual conference coming up at Yale University, but it will be live. So we will share that with you all. So we ask that you continue to support this programming and continue to support Dillard University. So thank you
Please,
so much. Thank
please.
thank you. Blessing you all. Have a good evening.
Bye
Thank
now.
you. Bye.